Welcome back, everybody, to another Money Mondays. We are speaking today from sunny Leeds on an absolute scorcher of a day, and today we're here to talk about where money actually comes from. This is a really interesting one and something that I realized maybe about 2, 3 years ago, and it made me reframe how I saw money, how I saw finance forevermore after that. Let's jump straight in and explain what I mean. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to jump straight into this webinar where money comes from. So where does money come from? Out of the ATM, right? That's what everybody thinks. But actually, that credit has to be created somewhere in the first place in order for it to appear in our bank account. And where it actually comes from is something that you either A, don't think about, or B, is totally counterintuitive whenever you know where it actually originates from. And here's why. It originates from, guess what? No surprises, banks, but not in the means that you might suppose that it is. So to answer this question, we have to delve into the fact that there's actually two types of bank. One is central banks and the other is commercial banks. And both of these create money, but in different ways. Now, I used the word credit very deliberately just a minute ago. Credit suggests debt, and actually all money originates from debt, and here's why. First of all, we're going to talk about central banks and how they create money. So a little bit of history. The original central bank was the Bank of England. It was created in 1694, and it was actually a backroom deal between William III and William Teller. William Teller was a Scottish banker. He spotted an opportunity to create money for the British government. William III needed money because he was presently in a naval battle with France. Fairly recently in his reign, there was a previous king who was indebted to the goldsmiths of London. He owed them a lot of money, and he just flat out repudiated the fact that he owed them this money, said that he wasn't going to pay his debts. So the crown at this point was considered a bad debtor, and that's why no one would lend to William III, even though that was his predecessor in terms of the lineage of the royal dynasty of England. No one would lend to William III, and so he was all out of options. So this guy, William Teller, basically said, I'm going to make a bank. You give me some of the king's gold so that I have that gold. Then I also have the right to create money. However, it doesn't have to be backed by gold in a 1-to-1 ratio. It only has to be partly backed by gold. And what that means is that I can basically print money. And how that mechanism was carried out or performed was the government would create something called a bond, which it would sell to the central bank, and the bank would give them in return some currency, some pounds. Now, if the government wanted to return to the bank and cash in that currency, they could only do that within certain limits because there wasn't enough gold in the bank to fulfill every single unit of currency they gave out. And hence fractional money was born, which eventually evolved into money that is not backed by anything, which is what we have today. And all that happens is the government creates these bonds out of thin air, pieces of paper or digital receipts, gives them to the bank. The banks give them in return currency, and hey presto, money is created. So basically, the government borrows it into existence, and the bank buys the bond, which didn't even exist until very recently anyway, and it's not backed by anything. How crazy is that? So the government just make the money up effectively. They borrow off the central bank so that it's shrouded in the guise or the ruse of the banking system, but really it's just an arm of the government. At least the Bank of England is. In America, it's slightly different, but the Bank of England is. It's crazy. By the way, this stuff is a total rabbit hole. But as I say, the craziest thing to understand is that this money is borrowed. It wouldn't exist unless the government borrowed it. It didn't exist. It wasn't just lying around. It only came into existence when the government made the bond and hence borrowed it from the Bank of England. Crazy. That's how money printing actually works. The second is commercial banks. Now, they can't print money. They can't print money, okay? They can buy bonds from the government. However, they cannot create money to obtain the bonds. They have to have the money in the first place. But how do they get that money? So how banks work, basically you'll put your deposit in a bank. This is how it works on a very simple level. You'll put your £100 in the bank will pay you interest, but it will then lend that £100 to other people and charge them a higher rate of interest. The difference between those two numbers is the bank's profit margin, or at least that's how they used to work. Nowadays, because of fractional reserve banking, they don't actually have to have, if the bank wants to lend £1,000, it doesn't have to actually have £1,000. It only has to have, say, 10% of that number, maybe like £100. Okay. So because of that, when that bank lends somebody money, really, where did that extra £900 come from? It's just created out of thin air. Yeah. But there has to be some money in the first place for the bank to do this. And that's why the central bank holds most of the power when it comes to money printing, because it is the only one who can create currency without any backing whatsoever. However, commercial banks actually create more money than central banks. About 93% of all money comes from commercial banks. This is modulated by interest rates. The lower the interest rate, the more the banks are willing to lend, because they have to be riskier with their capital in order to generate money. The higher the interest rate, the more likely they are to deposit their currency, their pounds, in the central bank. Where does the other 90% come from? They just make it out of flipping thin air. And they give it to borrowers. So in essence, every single pound is lent into existence. It either comes from a central bank or it comes from a commercial bank. How cool is that? There must be debt to be money supply. And that's why whenever there's times of strife and the government needs to print more money, the government's debt levels go up, because they're actually creating more of a circulating supply of money. Therefore, it is necessary. And that's to fish themselves out of potential economic disasters, out of deflationary spirals, which is something that we'll cover in another video. Which, now, a good example of one of those was what happened in the American Great Recession. They do everything they can to avoid that nowadays. The issue is the end game, when the government needs vast amount of money to service those bonds that we talked about earlier. And that's why the theory is that one of the possible outcomes of that is hyperinflation. How cool is that? Thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you all next week.